think this is part 3 of this little series of talks about a little panel I was on when we went to the monastic gathering. And it was about a panel about our practice, essentially. And as I was saying last time, one thing that I realized in preparing for that is I use phrases in my practice. And I decided for this just to call them slogans, but I don't quite call them that, but I suppose they are slogans. But I do use these phrases, and they're usually things that I've kind of had to work through, and then this phrase kind of distills it. And the ones I'm going to talk about today are the ones that are not so settled, though. The ones that are settled aren't so alive for me, actually, at the moment. They help me. There are things like be positive. I remind myself of that. Or, well, the one that's a little bit alive is I make a lot of mistakes. That's one of mine. But I find that helpful. It's just like a little self-acceptance pep talk or something. So I have my whole category of those. But where I'm more right now is in these ones that I haven't settled. And so I thought I'd talk about those. And there's one that's not even on there that's been really in my mind a lot. So maybe we'll start with this one. Don't compare yourself to others. That's that's from Venerable Chodron. And when she taught that at the time, she said that a number of times, but at the time where it really stuck with me was when she said, your self-centered thought will always make you see the comparison as I'm getting the short end of the stick. And there's a time where that's kind of true, and it's good to recognize that. But then I had the question, like, okay, earlier in this talk, I was talking about role models, and one of my earliest role models was this poem by Lao Tzu. So I thought I would read this again. The ancient masters were profound and subtle. Their wisdom was unfathomable. There's no way to describe it. All we can describe is their appearance. They were careful as someone crossing an iced-over stream, alert as a warrior in enemy territory, courteous as a guest, fluid as melting ice, shapeable as a block of wood, receptive as a valley, clear as a glass of water. Do you have the patience to wait till your mind settles and the water is clear? Can you remain unmoving till the right action arises by itself? The master doesn't seek fulfillment. Not seeking, not expecting, she is present and can welcome all things. So this ties into some of my disjointed thoughts. They actually come up in this. So, okay, don't compare yourself to others. What image does that poem evoke in you? You know, when I have that image, I have one kind of spiritual practitioner in mind. And then I look at my practice, and then the other day what was kind of helpful to my mind was to think about this Mahasiddhi, because to me that poem is very refined. But I spend my life with well pumps, pipes, and like my image has to include a little bit more, yeah, plumbing and things like that. And what do I do with all of that? So then there's this master of Siddhis, Tagun Gyalpo. He was, I think, in Tibet. He built a lot of iron bridges, and he was a Mahasiddhi. So he's carrying chains. He's got like chains hanging from him, and I think Janet Gatso actually did her thesis on this, so his story is out there, but he is part of this beautiful Chenrezig sadhana from the Sakya monastery. And so, yeah, who do you compare yourselves up? What images do we have of what we're trying to be as spiritual practitioners? So some of them are going to look like bridge builders, and some of them are going to flow like fluid as ice, melting ice. And so we have to leave ourselves some room, and that's for sure. And the other thing in this verse that one of my slogans, it's not so much a slogan, it's a recognition of sometimes the things that trip me up, is expectations, hopes, and fears. Those three things can pretty often, trip me up. Like if something's going on within me that I'm kind of unsettled about, that phrase sometimes comes to mind, and then I examine, what are my expectations here? What are my hopes? What are my fears? But in this poem, there's a beautiful kind of resolution to this in some ways that can work sometimes when you're suffering from your expectations, your hopes, or your fears, which is the master doesn't seek fulfillment. Not seeking, not expecting. She is present and can welcome all things. And this ties into my latest slogan, which is not on this, not on this paper, is I was listening to a podcast of Thupten Jinpa. And at one point he was talking about, translating for His Holiness for 30 or 40 years. And he said this thing kind of quickly, and I had to go back and listen to it. And he said, there's some kind of expression maybe in Tibet that familiarity breeds contempt. I was like, I just have been thinking about that for days now, and thinking about, like, in our equanimity meditation, like, why is it so much easier with strangers? And I realized that, familiarity, we have much more familiarity usually with our friends and our enemies and strangers are easier. And, there's that part of the mind that for me goes like, I'm just so tired of this, like you're just so familiar with something. And all these emotions come up around that. And so for me, I took that as a big warning, because especially when he told the story around this, the reason he said that little phrase is because he's been with His Holiness for so long. And when he notices in His Holiness, it's kind of like this poem. His Holiness always comes into things afresh. He uses the word freshly, but essentially afresh. It's kind of like the way he explained it, the way I understood it was that it would be like this. When things come up, we reify things, and we can get really weighed down with things. And then we can't really enter into a situation freshly. We're carrying a lot of baggage, and we have to use our practice and whatever to try to unload ourselves sometimes. But just like in this poem, or like His Holiness, to be able to enter things freshly like that, I think that's quite something. And to realize what we're working against is the things that weigh us down. Familiarity breeding contempt is quite a heavy load, I think. But to be on guard for those kind of things is what I take from that. It's like, there's some truth to that. I could see the places in my mind where that kind of frustration, or even that's more solid even than frustration, but where that could arise. And so, how do we work with that? I think being aware of, the equanimity meditation in particular can help us to tease this apart and see, where are we getting tripped up there? Where are our afflictions we're not able to lay them down, and we can't enter freshly into situations. So I think that's maybe one ties in also to the expectations, hopes, and fears, because those things also tend to weigh your mind down. They don't, you aren't entering freshly in those situations. At least I'm not. It's preloaded, or, it's preloaded somehow. I'm expecting this, I'm hoping this, I'm fearing this. I'm not able to enter freshly then, as, not seeking, not expecting. She is present and can welcome all things. That might take maybe some realizations to get there, but knowing, I see these as role models. And then my last one, which is, I think I've mentioned this before here, but it's one that is still in that category of what do I learn from this? And I think it's not so much in the phrase, but the commentary finally. So this was a couple of years ago. I was really wondering for some reason what made Mother Teresa tick. Why does she have so much inner strength? And I read her diaries. And there was one point where they were doing a guided retreat that she found really helpful, where the father or priest, I'm not sure which it was, leads this kind of retreat with questions. I think it's silent, but you do journaling and this and that. And then I'm reading along, and I read this thing, and it says, all things being equal, choose the hard thing. And I remember just thinking, are you kidding me? All things being equal, I'm taking the easy way out. And so I've just sat with that, like, where does that come into my life? Where do I make this work? And then I think it's really the commentary where I can make this work. She says, no one is going to force me to be holy. It lies in my own hands. I will be inferior, moderate, or very fervent, just as I choose. So it's like, I think, what Geshe Tekchok said, what is the value of our precious human life? It's not who we are, it's what we can do with it. And this is like this, like this push, like, oh, we're the only ones who can do this. We're the only ones who can live out our precious human life. And so it's a recognition. And so I'm not sure, like all things being equal, choose the hard thing. I don't know, this is one of those koans for me, I guess. We'll have to leave it at that. But something to think about. So those are phrases that help me to examine my life, my day, my practice, my mind, and just try to learn